You can start. Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday morning service. Om Yo Brahmanam Vidadhati Purvam Yo Vai Vedangscha Prahinoti Tasmai Tam Hadevam Atma Buddhi Prakasham Mumukshur Vai Sharanamaham Prapadye. We who seek refuge, we who seek liberation, take refuge in that infinite light which illuminates the hearts of all. That light which is the source of the Creator, Brahma himself, and which is the repository of the infinite knowledge, Veda. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning, is a topic in the series on basic concepts of Vedanta. We've dealt with such concepts as Brahman and the Jiva, the individual soul, karma, dharma, reincarnation, etc. And so now, today, we will take up the concept of Ishvara. Of course, these, I say concepts, they're not really concepts. What is a concept? A concept is a mental formulation, a mental idea, which should correspond to an actual reality. And so I have a concept of freedom, but then there is the experience of freedom. And so the concept of freedom I can share with a person intellectually, explain what I mean by freedom. So that is explaining the concept. But there should be the fact of freedom, which is felt, which is experienced. And so a concept, a true concept, is one which corresponds to a reality. And so the concept of the jiva is an intellectual way of understanding what the actual fact of a jiva is. The jiva being the individual, an individual being, like you or me, or the ant, or the bee, or the frog, or the tree or the grass. Whatever living being, sentient being there is a jiva. And so the concept explains intellectually how we understand it. And so with the concept of Brahman, Brahman is reality itself. Brahman is not a concept. Brahman is reality itself. But we have a conceptual way of understanding what Brahman is, because if we experience Brahman directly, then we are experiencing the reality which is beyond all conceptualization, beyond all words. And so the reality of Brahman is far beyond the possibility of conceptualization. And yet, in our present state, in this transactional world, this world of samsara that we live in, we deal in concepts. We don't deal so much in realities. Some things we do experience directly, the reality of certain things, like I have a sense of my own individual being. But to make sense out of my experience of individual being, I conceptualize it to try to understand what it is that I'm feeling. And then the reality of Brahman, which is beyond conceptualization and which we don't have an experience of at present. If we have an experience of Brahman, then we are liberated. we are realized souls. Then we become the teachers of the world. But we don't have that experience yet. And so we conceptualize it in the absence of experience. So some concepts are ways of explaining to ourselves and to others what it is that I'm experiencing. And then something like Brahman is, the concept is to point to a reality which we don't yet experience, but to point at it mentally, intellectually, even though it's beyond the mind. And so with Ishvara, the topic today, Ishvara, God. Ishvara is one of those generalized terms for God in Hinduism. In the Sanskrit tradition, Ishvara just means God. And so the worshippers of Vishnu call him Ishvara. Ishvara to the worshippers of Vishnu is Narayana or Vishnu or Krishna. Ishvara to a Shaiva is Shiva. Hence we have Maheshwara, the great God. Ishvara to a Shakta is Ishwari, the feminine form, which is the Devi, the goddess. And so Ishvara also is a reality at present beyond our direct experience. And again, if we have a direct experience of Ishvara, a realization of Ishvara, then we are liberated. Long before that, we may have visions of Ishvara, but those visions are not Ishvara as Ishvara. It's a manifestation, an appearance of Ishvara to us. Yes, it may be a real revelation, it may be a real vision, but still it's not Ishvara in itself, or in himself, or in herself. It is a manifestation. That's why in the Eastern Orthodox Church of Christianity, Christianity is found in Greece and Russia and Armenia and such countries where they are Orthodox Christians. Their theology says that no one can experience God directly, only God's manifestations. Now, by manifestations, they don't mean just this world, which is a creation of God. They mean that a person can have various experiences of God, but that's not God in his own reality. It's the signs, the emanations, the powers of God that we are experiencing. Now, Vedanta says that we can experience God directly, but that is at the level of the highest realization of the personal God, where we realize God in God's own nature, as Arjuna did on the battlefield when Sri Krishna revealed his universal form. But even that, some could say, was not yet realizing God in God's own being. It was realizing God as a manifestation of this universal being, controlling and guiding the destinies of all beings. So, again, today we're dealing with the concept of Ishvara, but we shouldn't be confused that what we want is a concept or that Ishvara is a concept. No, Ishvara is reality. And the concept is the way that we formulate in our minds an understanding, because the mind has nothing but conceptual understanding. And yes, sometimes direct feeling, but even to understand our direct feelings, we have to convert it into concepts to understand it. So again, we all feel that I exist, but until I try to conceptualize it, what is it that I'm feeling when I say that I exist? Until I've explained it to myself conceptually, I'm not really sure what it is I feel, though the feeling is direct. So the basic concepts, Ishvara, for today's topic. And of course, I need not explain that the topic of Ishvara, God, is extremely important. There are schools in Hinduism that don't accept the existence of Ishvara, like Sankhya. Many people believe, and I myself believe, that ancient Sankhya had a place for Ishvara. They didn't deny Ishvara. It was only in classical times, the age of the darshanas, the age of philosophical development, when the different traditional philosophies of Hinduism became expressed and expanded and explained, that Sankhya no longer dealt with the concept of Ishvara because it found it unnecessary. Even then, some scholars say that Sankhya never denies the existence of God. It just finds the question of God irrelevant, much as the Buddha did. Sankhya, like Buddhism, feels that, well, actually, no, not like Buddhism. I'll make a distinction. Sankhya felt that the universe is explicable in its own terms. We don't need to postulate something like God to explain the existence of the universe. We can analyze the universe and understand it in its own terms, which is what modern science does as well, through a different method, looking at different things. Also in Hinduism, the Mimamsakas, that is, those who gave importance to the Vedas, but the early part of the Vedas, the rituals, the rites and rituals, and so forth. They also say that there's no such thing as Ishvara. They don't have a belief in Ishvara. Even the gods are just words. They're not independent realities. And so the Mimamsakas also don't have a place for God. They deny the existence of God. Early Vaisheshika also had no place for God. Later, they incorporated the idea from classical Hinduism because it became just a natural belief in India for most people to believe in God and to assume the existence of God. But early Vaisheshika had no place for God either. It was just the play of atoms, of the elements of matter, and the principles of combining atoms. And so in Hinduism, there was a plentiful development of philosophy without the idea of God. And Buddhism was not interested in God for reasons different from the Sankhya philosophy. It's not that they felt the universe could be explained without God. They weren't even interested in explaining the origin of the universe. That was not a question that they thought had any usefulness to it. So you don't find in Buddhism developed cosmological theories about how the universe came to be. That the universe just is. That's all we need to know. But in Vedanta, Vedanta is a theistic system. Even Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, there is a place for God. Even if in one's spiritual life, if one follows jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, one need not even think about God, need not bring God into the discussion. But philosophically, Advaitins, non-dualists, believe that God is, God is real, but they are in search of the knowledge of the self and its identity with Brahman. And so, though many Vedantic texts talk about God, Ishvara, not all do, because it was considered superfluous for one that was just seeking to know who am I, and to find oneself as Brahman, the absolute, beyond all conceptualization, beyond any idea of an Ishvara even. So Ishvara as a reality and as a conceptual formulation is very important in Vedanta. It's not important for Sankhya, it's not important for Purva Mimamsa, wasn't at one time important for Vaisheshika. It's not important for Buddhists. But for most, and for those Vedantins who want to dispense with the idea of God, not as non-existent, but just as superfluous to their spiritual life, then that's fine. But for most Vedantins, God, even for non-dualists, God is central. For Shankaracharya, God, Ishvara, was extremely important, and many of the great writings of Shankaracharya are his poems devoted to different gods and goddesses. Madhusudana Saraswati, the great writer of the commentary on the Gita, and also writer of other books on non-dualism, he, all of his life, maintained deep devotion to Krishna, Sri Krishna. So, the concept of Ishvara. So first, the etymology, as I like to begin on other talks about such subjects, the etymology, that is the origin of the word Ishvara. It comes from a root, verbal root, as theoretically all Sanskrit words come, and most of them can actually be traced to a verbal root. It comes from the root ish, I-S-H, or I-S with an accent over it for the technical transliteration. And that would be a long I pronounced as E. So E, long, dirga E, and sh, talavya sh, or S with an accent over it. So the ish means to rule, to govern, to own, and to be capable of. To be capable of something, That is, to have the power to do something, to own, to rule, to govern, etc. And Ishvara means the greatest of rulers. Vara, like Brahmavidvara, the greatest of the knowers of, or actually the great knowers of Brahman. So here, the great ruler, the Ishvara. And the use of the term, you don't find Ishvara in the Rig Veda. You find ish, but ish, the forms of the verb ish, but there again, it means usually to be capable of something. And it's rare in the other Vedas. You do find not Ishvara, but Isha meaning God. Well, let me back up and say that the word Ishvara is generally not found in the Vedas, but excluding some of the Upanishads. But where it is found in the Vedas, it's not used in the sense of God. It's not used in the sense that later came to be attributed to Ishvara. Where it is used in the Vedas, it's used in the sense of being capable of something in the Rig Veda, and also it was used as to refer to a ruler. But in the Isha Upanishad, there you find that it's named after Isha, which means God. Isha, Ishvara, the same thing, from the same root, Ish. And so the Isha Upanishad is called the Isha Upanishad because it begins, Isha Vasyam idaggas sarvein yat kincha jagatyam jagat. So Isha, God, should be spread over everything here, everything that moves and does not move. That is, in better English, that's the direct translation, but in better English, it would come to see God in everything here, in what moves and what doesn't move. So there, Isha is used as God in the Isha Upanishad. And you find it in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, etc. So the idea of God gradually developed, but Ishvara was not used in the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, etc. So when the term Ishvara came into being, even at an early time, it was first used for such things as a king, Ishvara as a king or a great king, a ruler, or it was used for for husband, much as Swami. Swami, nowadays we think of Swami as a sannyasi, like myself, the title of a sannyasi. But even in modern Bengali, Swami is used to refer to one's husband. So just as Swami means can mean husband, so Ishvara meant a husband also. And so it was in the Dharma Sutras, which came in the Vedic, came in the Vedic age, the Dharma Sutras. There you find the term Ishvara meaning king. So again, king or husband, ruler, etc. And Isha as God by the time of the Upanishads. But before that, just in the sense of being capable of something, having the power to do something. But then by the time of the late Vedic age, into the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and then later the Puranas, then of course Ishvara became very common and a very popular term for God, meaning the great Lord. Just as in English, in Christianity and in Judaism, God was the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Lord of Hosts, the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. So Ishvara came to be not just a great king, but the Lord of Kings, or the Lord of Beings, the greatest king. That is, a king rules over a few people, but God rules over the whole universe. And so that was the derivational history of the word Ishvara. You find Ishvara used in Buddhism also, but not in the sense of God, but in the sense of one who has lordship. That is, one who has sovereignty over other beings. So you find the great Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara. Avalokita, Ishvara. The Lord of all that which is seen, Avalokita, that which is perceived. The Lord of everything perceived is Avalokiteshvara. So Avalokiteshvara was the great Bodhisattva. There's no history to a person named Avalokiteshvara, but it is part of the mythology, and again, not as falsehood, but as the mythical story of Mahayana Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama of Tibet is considered to be an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. Each Dalai Lama is the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. It's the lineage of human incarnations of Avalokiteshvara in the Tibetan Buddhist belief. Chinresi, as he's called in Tibetan. And then some of you know of Kuan Yin in China, Japan, Korea, Kannon Sama in Japan, and Kuan Yin in China, the Bodhisattva of compassion. That is also Avalokiteshvara, who, when going into China and then to other Far Eastern countries, became female. Avalokiteshvara was male, Lord of all that is seen, but Kuan Yin, Kannon Sama, became a female Bodhisattva, the goddess of compassion. So Ishvara became more and more used, again, even used in Buddhism, though not as God, but in classical Hinduism, Ishvara became the one of the main words, generalized words for God. In Hinduism, because of the idea of the different gods and goddesses, and that the infinite one non-dual reality manifests as different gods and goddesses, each one of which is reality itself, but different personal manifestations, different faces of the same reality. Most of the time in Hinduism, when we speak of God, most people speak from a sectarian standpoint, and I don't mean a narrow sectarian standpoint necessarily, and I don't mean anything bad by that. But worshippers of Shiva will talk of Ishvara as Shiva. Worshippers of Vishnu will speak of Ishvara as Vishnu or as Krishna or Rama, etc. Worshippers of the goddess will refer to Ishvara as the goddess, as the Devi or Bhagavati or Kali or Durga, etc. But Ishvara is one of those terms in Sanskrit, which is a generalized term, which just refers to God. And it can be used in a sectarian context or just in a general context for the general concept of God, which can apply to all of the major gods and goddesses. You have Ishvara, you have, as I said earlier, Maheshwara, that is the great God who is Shiva. So, of course, the votaries of any aspect of God always think of their aspect of God as the greatest. So there's Ishvara, but then there's Maheshwara, the greatest God, who is Shiva. And then there's Parameshwara, the supreme God. Often the Vaishnavas, Shaivas can use it too. Anyone can use it for their chosen ideal, but Vaishnavas especially use the term Parameshwara, the supreme Lord. So Ishvara or Parameshwara is God, generic God, and can be used for one's own chosen ideal. So let me come to the evolution of the concept of God. I've spoken about the word Isha, Ishvara. And now let me speak about the concept of God, dissociated from the word Ishvara. Because as I said, Ish is used in the Rig Veda, but only in the sense of to be capable of, not in the sense of God. But in the Rig Veda, there's developing the idea of God. And so you find in the Vedas, you have many different deities. You have Varuna, Mitra, Aditya, Ushas, female and male deities. Vishnu, Rudra, etc. Many different deities, and each had their own personality, each had their own function. And so among modern scholars, usually the Vedic deities are looked on as nature deities because Western scholars, when they began to examine the Vedas, they tried to draw a parallel between the Greek and Roman deities and the Norse deities and the Vedic deities. And parallels can be drawn. It's useful to draw parallels. But because the scholars looked on the deities of the Greeks and Romans and the Norse people as pure nature deities. That is, they look on these people as being primitive people who, before the great revelation of Christianity illuminated their heathen minds, before they had that great light to enlighten them, these people looked on the sun and thought it was a deity, or there was a deity inside the sun which made it burn. They felt the wind blowing, and so these primitive people thought that there was a deity who was blowing the wind, making it to blow. And that there was the vast ocean, so there must be a deity who is ruling the ocean. And so these are just natural forces which primitive people turned into deities. So I'm not saying that, that's what the scholars said. And that's the way they looked on the Greek and Roman deities, the Norse deities, and so certainly the Vedic deities must be the same. But no, it was far deeper than that. Yes, the deities were associated with natural phenomena, that's true. And the Vedic peoples saw personality everywhere. They saw personhood everywhere. That is, they saw consciousness everywhere and responsive consciousness everywhere. But it wasn't primitive as Western scholars liked to think, and as many modern Indian scholars educated in the Western thinking like to think as well. Sri Aurobindo was the first in modern times to really try to look deeper into the Vedic deities and see what they really represented. Swami Vivekananda had wanted that to be done, but in his short life, there wasn't time to do that. He left the work for others, and Sri Aurobindo is one of those who took up that work. And so he felt that he discovered, one can agree or disagree, because it's not yet proven one way or the other, but he felt that all of the Vedic deities represented spiritual energies. And so probably it was a combination of both. Just as among the Greek deities, the common people understood the deities in a very crude and physical material sense, that they were deities who controlled the natural forces. But there was mystical Greek life also, which we know almost nothing about. We just know that it existed, the mysteries of Greek religion, which one had to be initiated into and which were kept secret. But that certainly gave a mystical interpretation of the deities. And so in the Vedic deities also, yes, there are places where you can see them described as conscious entities which control the different functions of the cosmos. But at other times you see that there's something much, much deeper going on than that. They're seen as internal spiritual energies, spiritual dynamisms, spiritual facts which guide one to illumination, to deeper spiritual experience. So, and then there's some that even Western scholars, especially one that even Western scholars can't fit into and couldn't find a way to fit into this nature deity framework, and that is Aditi, the mother of the gods. Aditi, as even Western scholars admit, was perhaps the earliest attempt to formulate infinity, the concept of infinity. And so Aditi, the great mother goddess of the Vedas, is so abstract that you can't fit her into a nature deity pattern. And so even to skeptical Western scholars, she appears to have been an early way of conceptualizing infinity. and that which is beyond this visible universe. So again, probably both are true. The idea that the gods, there was the crude way of conceiving of the gods and the mystical way of conceiving of the gods, and the two are not contradictory. It's just one reality seen on a spectrum from the more physical to the most abstract and mystical. Now, Max Mueller, when studying the Vedas, the first great Western scholar to take up a deep study of the Vedas and to try to interpret the Vedas, he came up with the term, which surely most of you have heard, of henotheism. That is, there's polytheism, where there are many gods and goddesses. There's monotheism, where there's only one God and all other gods are false. There's only one God and only one way of looking at God. And then he said that he thought he found in the Vedas what he himself coined the term for, henotheism. And that refers to the fact that in the Vedas you see that these different deities each have their own personality, each have their own nature, which is described. And at the same time, you find that once in a while that a particular deity is taken and addressed as the supreme reality, as the supreme deity of the universe. And then another time, another deity is taken and raised to the position of a supreme deity of the universe. So henotheism was a way of describing this type of polytheism where the different gods each could be seen as the one God, the one reality. They could be in turn raised to that position. Now, that's not a very satisfying solution to the mystery of the Vedic concept of the deities. But certainly there was the idea that there are many deities, gods and goddesses both, but there was clearly the idea that was developing during the Vedas from an early time in the Vedas, the idea of one reality as well. And so it was natural that the different deities could in turn be seen as an image of the one reality, that they could be seen as the supreme Lord. And so you find these two ideas developing, which continued in Hinduism down to the present day. Swami Vivekananda said to Sister Nivedita, you see, it is Brahman, the infinite non-dual reality, the one without a second, the Brahman. But it's also the gods and goddesses. It's also the gods and goddesses. So even in later Hinduism, it's recognized that there is one reality, but there are also the gods and goddesses, even in classical Hinduism, what to speak of Vedic Hinduism. And so in the Vedas, you see the growth of these two ideas, the development of these two ideas. And so with the growth of the idea that a deity could be seen as the supreme deity of the universe, came the idea of Ishvara. Though again, that term came later than the Vedas themselves, the older part of the Vedas, unless you take some of the later Upanishads, some of which were even written in modern times. There was the Allah Upanishad, that is the Upanishad of Allah. That is, after Islam had come into India, then someone wrote an Allah Upanishad. And there is a Ramakrishna Upanishad as well. So the Upanishads, but the old Upanishads, which were original parts of the original Vedic texts, there you don't yet find the term Ishvara. Unless I may be wrong, it's found in the Shvetashvatara. I don't remember. So you find in the Vedas this wonderful statement, which is one of the first Sanskrit statements I heard and learned when I first came to Vedanta and began to read about Vedanta. In my early exposure to Vedanta, it was used much more than it is used nowadays, which is somewhat of a shame because it's a wonderful statement. And the fact that it was used was pointing to something good. And that statement is from the Rig Veda, Ekam sad vipra bahudha vadanti. Truth is one, ekam sad. Truth is one, vipra bahudha vadanti. Sages call it variously. The truth is one, but sages call it variously. And then in that same passage in the Vedas, that's the part that's famous and which is quoted. But in the same passage, it goes on to say different ways that one reality is named, like Mitra, Varuna, etc. It names different deities. So truth is one, but sages call it variously, and then the different deities are named. So it's a wonderful statement. And I say it was used a great deal in earlier years in the Vedanta movement in America, and not as much anymore. It was used to good purpose because it expresses one of the fundamental teachings of Vedanta that Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna thought the modern world needed. That is, that there is one reality, but it can be seen in many different ways. There are many expressions of that one reality. And it's only from that standpoint that we can establish religious harmony. Without that, religious harmony is impossible. Let me explain that in a moment. Here it's been raining very much, and whenever there's wet weather, I get to this congested throat, the way my body reacts to the weather. So the idea of religious unity, for some people, the idea of religious unity means that everyone should believe the way that we believe. Our religion is correct, other religions are wrong, and so everybody should convert to our way of religious thinking, and then there will be religious harmony. That's never going to happen because people are different. There are other traditions, I won't name names, there are other traditions which say that yes, all religions are good, all have their place, all are true, but we are the final religion. We're the religion which other religions are trying to get to in their own way, but we are the final culmination of religious thought, and people should come to us finally, or they should come to us now, because we are the final formulation. What you did was good, but now's the time to come to us. So it sounds very liberal, but it's another form of narrowness. And so that also will never happen. People are different. People conceive of, see the world in their own terms, and they see reality and God in their own terms. And so the only way that we can ever find religious harmony is to recognize that everyone is seeing the truth. It's just that they're seeing it from their own perspective, and leave them alone. Leave them alone. How much destruction could have been prevented if that idea, simple idea, had been there, instead of the idea among some of the missionary religions that we have the truth and everybody has to believe as we do. So destroy everything that is contrary to our religion because it's all pagan, it's all wrong. It'll lead people to the devil and to hell. And so we have to establish our religion. So whole civilizations were destroyed. When the Spanish first came to Mexico and later to Peru, South America, but the same thing happened, but just to simplify, I'll take Mexico. When they came to Mexico and they saw the Aztec civilization, they were amazed. They wrote in their records that in all of Europe they had seen no such glorious civilization as the civilization of the Aztecs. The wonderful functioning of the cities, the beautiful buildings that they had, the extraordinary markets that they had, the poetry, the philosophers. Yes, the Aztecs had philosophers, they had poets, artists, of course, historians, all of that. But because of that dominant idea that we have the only true religion, and these people have books without the light of Christ, therefore these books should be destroyed. So the libraries of the Aztecs were destroyed. The temples, the buildings were destroyed. Same thing happened in South America. Same thing happened to the Mayans in the Yucatan and Guatemala and Honduras. Such things happened in other countries as well. In fact, Europe, the great civilization of the Druids and others, that was all wiped off the face of the earth because of this idea that there's only one way to worship God. There's only one God, that's our God, not your God. And so great destruction has been done in the name of that idea, whether it was the Christians coming towards the west or the Muslims going towards the east and north and south. The same thing happened because of a narrow philosophy. As a religion, both are wonderful. I have great respect for Islam as a religion and for Christianity as a religion. But that one idea that there's only one way to worship God, and it just so happens that that's our way. It just so happens that the one way to worship God is our way. So that gives us the right to destroy everything else. How much damage was done to the world civilization. Destruction of Nalanda and other great universities, Takshila, Nalanda, etc. And the destruction of the civilizations in the Americas. So this idea, ekam sad vipra bahudha vadanti. There's truth is one, sages call it in various ways. There are many approaches to God. Leave people alone. Even if you think that people are following a superstition, if you want to tell them, fine. If they don't listen, leave them alone. What is wrong with leaving people alone? That's such a simple principle. That idea that I have to make everybody like me. It shows a profound insecurity, that I'm only secure if I can make everybody like me. No, leave people alone. So that was the basis of later Hindu liberality, starting from the Vedic age. The idea that God, that reality is one, but that reality manifests in many ways, including in many forms of gods and goddesses. And if you want a monotheistic God, do that. That's fine. No harm. Follow your monotheistic God. Let me follow my polytheistic God, whatever you like. But they're all approaches to the non-dual truth, and all of them are true in themselves. So again, in the Upanishadic age, in the Vedic age, you had all of these deities, as well as the gradual development of philosophical thought. But in the Upanishads, the attention turned to principle. What is existence? What is reality? Who am I? What is this body? What is behind the body? What is behind this universe? It was a search for principle. And so the emphasis on God, you find God mentioned, again, like in the Isha Upanishad, which was an early Upanishad. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad is full of the idea of God. But the general trend of the Upanishads was looking for principle, not for God. But then after the Vedic age, then you find again the efflorescence, the flowering of the idea of God in many, many different forms. And so you get the Puranas and the Itihasas, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, etc., which are rooted in the Vedic age, but began to be written down and communicated in later times. So where then you see that the idea of God becomes fully developed by the time of the Puranas. And you find that the new deities that had their roots in the Vedas also, but new deities came from the Vedic roots, like Shiva, who grew out of the idea of Rudra. So Shiva, Vishnu, who's Vedic, but the new classical Vishnu is a new understanding of Vishnu. And so with the Bhagavati or Devi, the goddess, Durga, etc., you find the development of the great forms of Ishvara, Parameshwara, like Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, the goddess, as Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati, etc., different forms of the goddess. And then you find the somewhat lesser deities, but extremely important, like Ganesha. Ganesha is a deity. And there were some who looked on Ganesha as the supreme deity. But generally, Ganesha became a deity worshipped by everyone, as not as the supreme deity, but as the sort of the doorkeeper leading into the supreme. And so you find the worship of Ganesha spread everywhere. And there you find the worship of Kartik and Hanuman, etc. all considered as deities, but not as the not in the on the same category for most as Parameshwara, worshipful, divine, but again not like Shiva for most, not like Shiva, Vishnu, and the goddess. So you find this development of the idea of Ishvara. And Ishvara is God as the chosen ideal as well. That idea grew in India, that the chosen ideal is each person has a way of looking at God which is natural to them, which is their favorite way. That's what Ishta means, the chosen or the favorite way of looking at God. And so Ishvara, whatever your chosen ideal is, that is Ishvara. Because Ishvara, again, just means God. So then let me come at it from a different perspective before we close. The idea of Saguna and Nirguna Brahman. So what is the relationship to Ishvara and Brahman? We've already had a lecture on the basic concept of Brahman, but what is the relationship? So we have the idea of Saguna and Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman means Brahman beyond all attributes, beyond all time, space, and causation, beyond all conceptualization, beyond visions, beyond spiritual experiences, reality itself, which can only be known through identity, can only be known by identifying myself and becoming Brahman, realizing myself to be Brahman. I can know Brahman through identity. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. That's the only way to know Brahman, not by saying it, but by realizing it. So that is Nirguna Brahman. Nothing can be said of Nirguna Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna said that only Brahman is the only thing that is not uchishta. Uchishta means touched by the mouth and made impure by touching with the mouth. In Indian culture, anything that touches the mouth is considered impure. And so even if you touch your lips, you're supposed to go, in Orthodox society, you're supposed to go and wash your hands after touching your lips because your hands have become dirty. You couldn't touch anything else with your hands after touching your lips. And so Sri Ramakrishna said that only Brahman is not uchishta, that is touched with the lips, because there is no way of conceiving of Brahman. Anything we say about Brahman is neti neti, not this, not this. But God, Ishvara, is that same reality, but saguna, with the infinite repository of divine qualities, repository of divine qualities, the qualities of omniscience, all-knowingness, omnipotence, infinite power, infinite power, unlimited power, omnipresence, all-pervasiveness, existing everywhere. Nothing exists apart from it. And infinite goodness, infinite perfection, infinite love, infinite beauty, all of that is the nature of God. So Ishvara is the repository of infinite qualities, and Brahman is even beyond that. But the two are the same reality. Sometimes it's said that Nirguna Brahman, the attributeless Brahman, Brahman in itself, is Para-Brahman, the Supreme Brahman. And Ishvara, the Saguna Brahman with infinite divine qualities, is Apara Brahman, is the lower Brahman. And so from that description, you get the idea, and it's only in Advaita Vedanta that you find these terms. No devotee would use those terms. But from that expression of Para-Brahman and Apara-Brahman, you get the idea that Ishvara is a temporary illusion that we use in order to get to the real thing, to get to Brahman. Brahman is the real thing, and we use Ishvara to get there. So it's a temporary illusion. Once we get to Brahman, there's no Ishvara. The world disappears, my individuality disappears, and God disappears, and there's only Brahman, so it was just a temporary illusion. No, it's true that in Brahman, there are no qualities because it transcends all qualities. There is no relationship. There is no idea of God, just infinite, inexpressible, indescribable reality. But that is the heart of God. That's who God is. If we get close enough to God, we find that we're melting into the infinite, which is the heart of God. So rather than thinking of Ishvara as a temporary illusion that we use in order to get to the real thing, which is Brahman, no, both are the same reality. As Sri Ramakrishna said, the snake still and the snake in motion. There's the same snake. It's the same snake. It's the same reality, which is Brahman and which is God. So the Shaivas express it as Shiva in samadhi and Shiva dancing. Shiva in samadhi is Nirguna Brahman. Shiva dancing is Saguna Brahman. That is God. It's the same reality. It's the same Shiva. It's the same goddess, Kali, who is Nirguna Kali, beyond all conception, and then Saguna Kali, who is dancing, who this universe is the dance of Kali. So we should think of God and Brahman as the same reality. You as an individual spiritual aspirant, you may prefer one over the other, and that's fine. You don't need both. You can go after one or the other if you like. And some people may like both and want to include both in their spiritual practice. That is fine too. But either is good, or both is good. Both are good. Again, the problem in many expressions of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta, and the path of Jnana Yoga, because they're intent on realizing the Nirguna Brahman and their identity with Nirguna Brahman, they relativize God as part of the relative universe, as part of Maya. And so forget about that and go for the real thing, which is Brahman. That's a function of the way of thinking to follow that path. But we shouldn't use that as a weapon for destroying devotion and for destroying the idea of the personal God. If you want to seek just self-knowledge through the path of Jnana Yoga, good, do that. That's an integral path, a wonderful path, and a path which you can follow to its ultimate conclusion of realization. But the devotion also is an integral path which leads to liberation, to enlightenment. Look at there are examples in the Hindu tradition, but let me use outside examples also, like the great Christian mystics and the great Sufi mystics. There were some Christian mystics and some Sufi mystics who realized the non-dual state. But what did they say? They didn't start, because in Christian theology and Orthodox Islamic theology, there's no room for that idea, aham brahmasmi, I am Brahman, and nothing else exists. So they started from a devotional standpoint, a standpoint of love and devotion. And so they worshiped God, and they came like people like Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, Saint Angelina di Foligno, a great medieval Italian saint. They came closer and closer to God. They had the experience of God. They went closer and closer until they melted into God and could no longer find a distinction between themselves and God. They realized the non-dual state where they disappeared into the being of God. As Saint Angelina di Foligno says, there was no Trinity. There was no Trinity. There was no distinction whatsoever. There was no distinction of I and thou. There was just reality. But for her, that was coming to the very heart of God. She didn't get there and say, oh, all that Trinity business and God and all of that stuff, I believed in that for so long. That's all. Now I don't need all of that junk anymore. That's all nonsense and superstition. Now I've got the real thing. No. She knew that God and the heart of God are the same thing. That there's God we see as the beloved, and then when we come so close into union with God, then there's just the non-dual reality of God. But it's the same reality. And so it's much more helpful to us if we think in those terms, that God and God is Brahman, Brahman is God. It's the same reality depending on our perspective. So in conclusion, let me say that in Buddhism, there are gods but no God. The Buddhists, unlike what many people believe, the Buddhists didn't negate the gods. They accepted the gods. In fact, when Buddha attained enlightenment, the gods came to bow down before the Buddha because they saw him as greater than themselves. So these were gods who were the minor deities. That they accepted, and they still accept. But they didn't accept God as Ishvara, that is the supreme Lord of the universe. What they accepted was that there is a state called enlightenment, in which one becomes all-knowing. There's a state called enlightenment. There are those who have attained to that in rare periods of human history, and they are called Buddhas. Maybe one who comes in a cycle of the only historical Buddha we know was Gautama Buddha, though he said that there had been Buddhas long before his time and an infinite succession of Buddhas at rare ages in human history. And then there are people who attain to enlightenment, a relative form of enlightenment, who are called arhats, and then there are the bodhisattvas. But the state of enlightenment is realized fully by a Buddha. The Buddha becomes all-knowing and all-powerful, and the Buddhas, the cosmic Buddhas, that is those that are the various Buddhas that are believed in, especially in Mahayana Buddhism and to some extent in Theravada. And then the bodhisattvas, they become like the gods and goddesses of other religions. So there's just a state of enlightenment, and then there are the Buddhas and the bodhisattvas that they provide for people, and they become very much, they serve the same purpose as the gods and goddesses do in different traditions. Though a Buddhist will certainly explain them differently, and I respect that, but functionally, they serve a similar purpose. So Vedanta teaches that there is Brahman, but that Brahman also manifests as God. That is, Brahman in relationship to us. Brahman as Brahman in itself, in its Nirguna aspect, has no relationship. In Brahman, there's no world, there's no universe, there's no creation, there are no living beings, there's nothing. No thing, I should say. Only reality, no thing. And so you can't worship Brahman. You can seek to know your identity with Brahman, but you can't worship Brahman, you can't pray to Brahman, you can't bow to Brahman. But Brahman, that same reality, in relationship to us, is the personal God. And so that also is real, and that we can approach. So Vedanta provides Brahman and God, and then the avatars, much like the Buddhas of Buddhism, except that the avatars come from a state of enlightenment to a state of manifestation in human form, whereas the Buddhas go from being human beings to attaining a state of enlightenment and remaining in enlightenment. Vedanta says that Brahman is the ultimate reality, yes, because you can't go further than Brahman. If you come so close to God that you melt into God, then you have found God as Brahman. You can't go further than non-duality. Where will you go beyond non-duality? So that's why Brahman is considered ultimate reality. But that Brahman is also the personal God. As I said, Sri Ramakrishna gave the example of the snake in motion and the snake at rest. The snake at rest, the snake in itself, not moving, that is Brahman beyond all change. But the same snake moving is like the personal God that is in relationship to us. Or another image can be given of the ocean. The ocean in its depths is like the Nirguna Brahman, where there's just water, nothing but water, everywhere water, nothing else, only reality. No things, just samarasa, the same taste throughout, that is the same nature throughout. But then you have the surface of the ocean where there are waves and foam and so many things happening. But that the waves and the foam and the whirlpools, those all and bubbles, those also are nothing but water, nothing but water. And so the same with Brahman and God. God is nothing but Brahman. So I'll stop here. And I'll give announcements, and after the announcements, if there are any questions, I will take those. So the announcements now are, on Tuesday, we'll have the usual class on the Bhagavad Gita at 7:30. On Thursday, there will be the class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna at 11 o'clock in the morning. Next Sunday, I will speak on Holy Mother. And I have another announcement about Holy Mother. We had sent out an announcement that we would observe Holy Mother's birthday on the her solar birthday. That is her birthday according to the solar calendar, which was December 22nd. But that's going to be a Tuesday, so we have thought better of it in consultation with the devotees here. And so we're going to move Holy Mother's observance to January 1st. Because that is always a holiday. And so from now on, we plan, as some of our other centers do, like San Francisco, our Dallas center also, they observe Holy Mother's birthday every year on January 1st. So from now on, we plan to make January 1st a celebration both of Kalpataru Day, the day of Sri Ramakrishna's self-manifestation, and also the worship of Holy Mother. So December 22nd, we will not have the worship here. So we will have a Christmas worship, and we will send out a flyer with the details soon for that. Okay, questions? What is pantheism? Yes, Regina, pantheism. Pantheism is the great bugbear, meaning the thing that scares Western religions terribly, traditionally. Pantheism means that God has become everything. And so Western religions, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, they are radically opposed to any form of pantheism. But there is gross pantheism, and gross, I don't mean like that. By gross, I mean just a crude form of pantheism. And there is refined pantheism. So the crude pantheism says that God has become this table, God has become a block of cement, God has become the house, God has become the worm, God has become the tree, etc. That's a crude form of pantheism. Which says that everything here, God has become this world. The problem with that, and the reason why Jews, Christians, and Muslims are against that, is that if God has become this, then that means God is changeable. And then what kind of God do you have if God has become a piece of cement, a brick, a stone, a fly, a mosquito, etc.? Then you have a changeable God, and God has lost God's transcendent glory. And so the Abrahamic traditions were always insistent on protecting the transcendent glory of God, that there's a strict distinction between God the creator and the creatures. Creatures are not creator. Creator is eternally separate from creatures, eternally different from the creatures. God makes us and makes this, but is completely separate from this that he has made. Vedanta doesn't ascribe to that. It agrees with the Abrahamic traditions that God remains transcendent, but it has what we could call a refined form of pantheism. That is, that God appears as this universe. This whole universe is nothing but God, but we are misreading it. We're seeing it as dull, dead, and sentient matter. No, it's not. It's the shining light of God. Everything is the light of transcendent spirit. Everything is God, divine, but we don't see it that way. So in that idea of pantheism, yes, God has appeared as everything. Everything that we see is God. But it's not that God has become, leaving God's own nature, God has turned into a stone and turned into planets and mountains and oceans and things. No. That we are just misperceiving God. God is God, and we are perceiving the divine being as all of this. So what I have to do as a spiritual aspirant is to refine my mind and my senses and my ability to perceive until I begin to look at everything and see the light of God shining through it. And then I begin to see that everything is just sort of a veil, a vibration in the ocean of God. The things are not the separate things that we saw. They're not the concrete things that we saw. They're really the divine being itself. So, yes, Sue. Now, what is that? Oh, might is right. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I wasn't understanding because I was still thinking in terms of pantheism and things. I was trying to fit that into that. So yes, you're going back to an earlier part of the lecture, which is fine. It's just that I wasn't there, so I couldn't understand. So yes, the idea of might is right. That if I have superior power, then that means that I am superior to you. If I have superior power, that means that God is on my side. And so therefore I have the right to lord over you. And so that was also a part of this. Part of it was that my view of God is right and your view of God is wrong. And because my view of God is right, and because I have superior technological power and force of arms and force of people, I'm more organized in my battle techniques and things, therefore God is on my side. So you see people in battle, throughout history, in battle, people on both sides are praying to their concept of God. Help us. And only one wins in a battle. So does that mean that the other side that lost, that their idea of God is wrong, or that even if they're praying to the same God, say two Christian nations are fighting each other and one wins and the other loses, that God loves the side that won more? No, that's a crude idea of God, that God is picking favorites. And these people are praying to me, those people are praying to me, but I like them more, so they're going to win, so I give them victory. No, that's all just using our human way of thinking in order to ascribe it to God and to claim glory for ourselves and authority for our victory, that our victory, our justification for our victory. So yeah, that might is right is never right. Yes.
We are saying that Brahman is beyond speech, beyond thought, and so on. And when we put personal God, the visualization, vision, as well as quality and so on, then it is a mind imposing things on it.
That's a good question. So the question for those of you who can't hear Jiten asking is that we say that Brahman is beyond speech and mind and completely transcendent in everything. And God also, in God's own nature, is beyond mind and speech. Ishvara also is beyond mind and speech. But yet, we have the gods and goddesses where we have the images of the gods and goddesses that we worship and so forth. So is that just, the question is that just the mind imposing its own images onto the reality? That's one way of thinking of it, but a better way to think of it is what Swami Vivekananda said, because he was answering that very idea. He said that the images we have of the gods and goddesses, like Ganesha, like Kali, like Shiva, the way that we picture them, he said these are the forms that great saints have actually perceived in deep states of ecstasy and meditation. So these are the forms that have been revealed, that God, playing in the form of Ganesha, reveals himself to have an elephant head and a pot belly. That's a form that God has revealed in deep states of prayer and meditation to sages. God likes to play in the form of Shiva. God likes to play in the form of Kali and Durga. God likes to play in the form of Christ and of Mary. And so from a Hindu standpoint, there's no problem with looking on Mary as divine. In Christian theology, that's completely inadmissible. Mary is not divine. She's a creature like you and me. Only she was especially pure, and God made her especially pure so she could be a vessel in which Jesus was born. But the saints who have had the vision of Mary, who have had the grace of Mary, and so if that Christian experience had come to India and spread as one of the sects within Hinduism, then certainly Mary would long ago have been recognized as a form of the mother goddess. And so these different personal aspects, they are forms that the deity likes to play in. So it's not that people sit around and make up an image. but that God appears in these forms, and then sages describe them and artists paint them. So we'll stop with that. I'll give a closing chant. Om Dyo Shanti Antariksham Shanti Prithvi Shanti Apas Shanti Oshadhaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shanti Sarvam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Sama Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace is in the heavens, peace is in the sky, peace is on earth, peace is in the waters, peace is in the plants and the trees. The gods are peace. Peace is the nature of truth. All is peace, peace alone, peace. May that peace, real peace, be with us all. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.